America celebrated victory in 1918. But beneath the parades and flags, the nation was already breaking apart. As World War I ended, millions of soldiers returned home expecting opportunity and stability. Instead, they found rising inflation, scarce jobs, and a fragile economy struggling to absorb them. Factories that had thrived during wartime began to slow. Wages fell. Housing grew crowded. Competition for survival intensified almost overnight. What should have been a moment of unity became a breeding ground for fear, resentment, and blame. For African Americans, the pressure was even greater. During the war, hundreds of thousands had moved north in search of work and safety, filling industrial jobs left vacant by deployed soldiers. Now, with peace declared, white veterans demanded those positions back. Economic anxiety quickly turned into racial hostility, fueled by long-standing prejudice and amplified by sensational headlines and political rhetoric. Neighborhoods became fault lines. Public spaces became battlegrounds. The promise of peace dissolved into something far more dangerous. This is the story of how a nation at the height of its global power failed to secure peace at home, how victory abroad masked a deep social crisis within, and how the end of a world war ignited a domestic explosion that would forever change American history. Before we continue, take a moment to support this channel. If you value in-depth historical storytelling and carefully researched narratives, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support helps bring overlooked stories like this one to light. Now, let us step into post-war America, where economic fear, racial injustice, and political instability collided, setting the stage for one of the most explosive summers the nation had ever seen. As the post-war economy tightened and fear spread through American cities, a quiet but transformative movement was already reshaping the nation from within. Trains leaving the Deep South carried more than passengers. They carried hope, defiance, and a collective decision to abandon a system that had offered little beyond hardship and exclusion. For millions of African Americans, the South had become a place where opportunity was rationed by race and enforced by custom, law, and intimidation. The end of the war did not soften those boundaries. Instead, it sharpened them, and so families packed what they could, said uncertain goodbyes, and followed the promise of industrial wages and relative safety toward the North and the Midwest. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and St. Louis became destinations of possibility. Factories needed labor, and wartime demand had opened doors that had long been closed. African American workers stepped into steel mills, meat packing plants, rail yards, and assembly lines, building the industrial backbone of modern America. Entire neighborhoods formed almost overnight, alive with new churches, newspapers, businesses, and social networks. These communities were not simply seeking survival. They were building a future, one shaped by self-determination and dignity rather than enforced submission. But this movement unfolded at the exact moment when the nation's economic balance was collapsing. White workers returning from the battlefields of Europe encountered a reality far different from the one they had imagined. Jobs were scarce, wages were falling, and the sense of entitlement promised by victory felt betrayed. In that atmosphere of anxiety, the presence of black workers in northern factories and neighborhoods became a symbol of loss rather than a sign of shared struggle. Economic fear blurred into racial resentment, and long-standing hierarchies that had once been confined to the South now reasserted themselves in cities that claimed to be more progressive. Housing became one of the most visible points of conflict. African American families, often restricted to overcrowded districts by discriminatory practices, search for space in rapidly expanding cities. Each move beyond an invisible boundary was seen by many white residents as an invasion, not a neighbor's search for stability. Rumors spread quickly, stoked by sensational reporting and political opportunism, turning ordinary acts of migration into imagined threats. Streets that had once been neutral became contested territory, and daily life carried an undercurrent of tension that rarely made headlines until it erupted. Yet the migrants themselves were not passive figures in this unfolding drama. Many had experienced the discipline and danger of wartime industry or military service. Even if they had not been allowed to fight on equal terms, they arrived with a new awareness of their collective strength and an unwillingness to retreat quietly into invisibility. Northern cities offered no utopia, but they offered space to organize, to speak, and to imagine a different relationship with the nation they had helped sustain during the war. This clash between aspiration and resistance became a defining feature of post-war America. The Great Migration did not merely redistribute labor. It forced the country to confront contradictions it had long ignored. Freedom promised abroad could not be denied indefinitely at home without consequence. Economic competition, layered upon racial inequality, transformed personal anxieties into collective hostility. By the summer of 1919, the tension woven into factories, neighborhoods, and public spaces was no longer contained. The movement of millions had challenged an old order, and the backlash it provoked revealed just how fragile America's post-war peace truly was. While trains carried families north and factories filled with new workers, another group was returning home with expectations shaped not by rumor or hope, but by lived experience. Black soldiers came back from World War I having worn the uniform of the United States, having marched under its flag, and having survived a conflict that reshaped the global order. Many had fought in segregated units, commanded by officers who doubted them, yet they had proven discipline, courage, and loyalty under fire. In France, some encountered a level of respect denied to them at home, a brief but powerful glimpse of what life could feel like without the constant weight of enforced inferiority. That experience changed them. These veterans returned not as silent laborers or cautious migrants, but as men who had stood in the machinery of a world war and emerged with a sharpened sense of worth. They had defended democracy abroad, and they expected its principles to follow them home. Instead, they stepped into the same nation described in earlier chapters of this story, one already strained by economic uncertainty and unsettled by the Great Migration. Jobs were scarce, housing was contested, and social hierarchies felt threatened. Into this unstable environment walked black veterans wearing uniforms that symbolized service, sacrifice, and an undeniable claim to citizenship. For many white Americans, that symbol was deeply unsettling. The sight of black men in military attire disrupted long-standing assumptions about obedience and status. Newspapers and political voices, already feeding economic fear, portrayed returning veterans not as heroes but as agitators, casting dignity as defiance and confidence as danger. The contradiction was stark. A nation that had relied on black soldiers in wartime now resisted their presence in public life, workplaces, and civic spaces. Respect earned on European battlefields dissolved at American train stations. These veterans did not arrive seeking confrontation, but they were no longer willing to accept humiliation as the price of survival. Having faced artillery fire and foreign trenches, they found it increasingly difficult to submit to insults, exclusion, or silent dismissal. Their presence altered the emotional landscape of black communities across the North and South. Churches, meeting halls, and social clubs filled with conversations about rights, protection, and collective responsibility. Military discipline translated into organized thinking, and wartime sacrifice became moral authority. At the same time, the return intensified existing tensions. In cities already struggling to balance labor competition and overcrowded neighborhoods, black veterans embodied the convergence of multiple anxieties. They were workers competing for jobs, residents seeking housing, and citizens asserting visibility. Each role challenged a different layer of the old order. Small confrontations, once ignored, now carried symbolic weight, and misunderstandings escalated more quickly in an atmosphere charged with suspicion. Yet these men also planted the seeds of a profound transformation. Their refusal to retreat into silence marked a shift in how African Americans engaged with the nation's promises. They understood that dignity was not a favor to be granted, but a condition to be defended. This mindset did not emerge in isolation. It grew alongside the migration, the economic struggle, and the widening gap between American ideals and American reality. As the summer of 1919 approached, the return of black soldiers stood as a powerful reminder of the nation's unresolved contradictions. Victory had expanded America's influence abroad, but it had also exposed the limits of its democracy at home. The men who came back from war carried more than memories of battle. They carried a challenge to the country itself, asking whether freedom was truly universal or merely selective, in a society unwilling to answer that question honestly. The tension they represented could not remain contained for long. By the time the long, tense summer arrived, the pressures that had been building across the nation no longer needed a spark so much as an excuse. Economic fear, mass migration, and the return of confident black veterans had woven together into a fragile social fabric, stretched thin across American cities. When that fabric finally tore, it did so not in one place, but in dozens. From the urban centers of the North to the rural heartland of the South, violence spread with alarming speed, revealing how widespread and deeply rooted the crisis had become. In Washington, see the nation's capital and a symbol of democratic authority, rumors and inflammatory reporting ignited days of unrest. Crowded neighborhoods became zones of confrontation as residents struggled to protect homes and livelihoods amid an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. The presence of federal buildings and uniformed personnel offered little reassurance. Instead, the events unfolding in the Capitol underscored a painful truth. The ideals proclaimed at the center of American power did not automatically translate into safety or justice for all who lived beneath its shadow. Chicago soon became one of the most visible flashpoints. The city had grown rapidly during the war, drawing migrants from the South and workers from across the country into its factories and stockyards. Its neighborhoods were sharply divided by race and class, with invisible boundaries understood by everyone who lived there. When those boundaries were crossed, tension that had simmered for years boiled over. Days of chaos followed, marked by fear, displacement, and loss. Streets that once echoed with industrial noise fell into uneasy silence, broken only by the realization that the city's growth had outpaced its willingness to confront inequality. Far from the northern cities, the violence reached a different scale in Elaine, Arkansas. There, black sharecroppers had attempted to organize for fair treatment, a quiet effort rooted in economic survival rather than confrontation. The response was swift and overwhelming. Armed groups descended on the area, and order collapsed under the weight of panic and retaliation. What unfolded was not an isolated disturbance, but a devastating reminder of how fragile black life remained in regions where power was enforced through fear. The aftermath left scars that would linger for generations, rarely acknowledged beyond the communities that bore the cost. These outbreaks were not random, nor were they disconnected. Each reflected local conditions shaped by national forces. Job competition intensified resentment. Housing shortages turned neighbors into rivals. Veterans asserting dignity challenged assumptions that had long gone unquestioned. In city after city, minor incidents escalated because the underlying tensions had never been addressed. Authorities often proved unprepared or unwilling to intervene effectively, reinforcing the sense that protection depended on race rather than citizenship. What made this period especially significant was its scope. More than 30 cities experienced similar eruptions, each with its own story but all echoing the same unresolved conflict. Newspapers struggled to contain the narrative, sometimes amplifying fear rather than calming it. Communities watched events unfold elsewhere and recognized familiar patterns, realizing that what was happening was not an anomaly but part of a national reckoning. For African Americans, these events shattered any remaining illusion that migration alone could deliver safety or equality. For white Americans, they exposed the consequences of resisting social change while benefiting from a system under strain. The violence of that summer revealed how easily democratic ideals could be undermined when economic anxiety and racial hierarchy collided. As the season drew to a close, the nation stood altered. The unrest had forced America to confront itself, not as it wished to be seen, but as it was. The events in Chicago, Washington, Sea Lane, and dozens of other places marked more than a series of disturbances. They formed a collective turning point. The question was no longer whether change was coming, but how much resistance the country would offer before acknowledging that the old order could not hold. In Chicago, the tensions that had been tightening across factories, neighborhoods, and city streets finally found a tragic focal point on a hot summer day along the shore of Lake Michigan. The lake, meant to be a place of relief from crowded housing and relentless labor, was itself divided by invisible lines. Certain stretches of water were understood to belong to white residents, others to black residents, even though no law marked the boundary. Everyone knew where they were expected to stay, and everyone knew the consequences of crossing that line. When a black teenager drifted across that unseen boundary while swimming, the response was swift and cruel. Stones were thrown from the shore, panic spread in the water, and the young swimmer did not survive. What followed was not only grief, but outrage, sharpened by a decision that would echo through the city. Authorities at the scene refused to hold accountable the person responsible, despite clear testimony, while focusing their attention elsewhere. In that moment, the long-standing distrust between black communities and the institutions meant to protect them hardened into certainty. The news traveled quickly through a city already primed for unrest. Chicago in 1919 was a place transformed by war and migration, its population swollen, its housing strained, its workforce divided along racial lines. Black families who had arrived seeking stability now lived packed into narrow districts, surrounded by hostility and economic uncertainty. White workers, facing job competition and falling wages, interpreted any assertion of equality as a threat to their own fragile footing. The death at the lake did not create these conditions. It exposed them, stripping away any remaining pretense of coexistence. As anger spread, the city fractured along its most vulnerable seams. Streetcars stopped running through contested neighborhoods. Businesses shuttered their windows. Families barricaded themselves indoors, listening for sounds that signaled danger. Rumors raced faster than facts, each one intensifying fear and suspicion. The violence that followed was chaotic, driven less by coordination than by a collective sense that the rules had collapsed and that protection could no longer be assumed. What made Chicago especially significant was not only the scale of the unrest, but what it revealed about urban segregation. The city prided itself on progress and industry, yet its neighborhoods were rigidly divided, enforced by custom, intimidation, and neglect. The lakefront incident made those divisions impossible to ignore. A single crossing of waterlines symbolized years of constrained movement, limited opportunity, and enforced separation. When that symbol was met with lethal consequence and official indifference, it confirmed what many already knew. The city's promise of fairness did not extend equally to all who lived within it. Law enforcement responses further deepened the crisis. Inconsistent intervention and visible bias reinforced the perception that order was being maintained selectively. For black residents, this meant relying on community networks rather than public institutions for safety. For white residents, it fed the belief that control had to be asserted directly. Each reaction intensified the other, creating a cycle that pulled the city deeper into turmoil. Unrest did not exist in isolation. News of the events echoed those unfolding in other cities that summer, from the capital to rural towns far from the industrial north. But Chicago stood as a stark illustration of how quickly modern urban life could unravel when inequality was left unaddressed. The city's factories and railways had powered the nation's war effort, yet its social foundations proved dangerously unstable in peace. When the violence finally subsided, Chicago was left changed. Physical damage could be repaired, but the psychological rupture ran deeper. Trust in public institutions had eroded, and the boundaries between communities felt more rigid than before. The death of a teenager in the water had become a defining moment, not because it was unique, but because it revealed the cost of pretending that segregation and bias could coexist with democratic ideals. In the broader story of that explosive summer, Chicago became a warning. It showed how everyday spaces could turn into flashpoints, how ordinary injustice could ignite extraordinary consequences, and how a city's failure to confront its divisions could transform a single tragedy into days of collective trauma. While northern cities struggled with crowded streets and contested neighborhoods, the violence that unfolded in rural Arkansas revealed a darker and even more devastating side of the same national crisis. In Phillips County, near the small town of Elaine, African-American sharecroppers lived under an economic system designed to keep them permanently indebted. Cotton prices fluctuated wildly after the war, yet laborers were rarely allowed to see accurate accounts of what they owed or earned. For years, quiet resentment had grown in fields and tenant cabins, fueled by the same post-war pressures reshaping the rest of the country. In 1919, a group of black sharecroppers began meeting to discuss fair accounting and legal representation, hoping to protect themselves from exploitation rather than provoke confrontation. Their efforts reflected the broader shift already underway across America, where migration, military service, and wartime sacrifice had encouraged African Americans to believe that dignity and fairness were not unreasonable demands. But in a region where power was tightly held and rarely questioned, even the suggestion of organization was interpreted as rebellion. Fear spread rapidly among white landowners, magnified by rumors that exaggerated intentions and erased context. What began as a local dispute quickly escalated into something far larger, driven by panic and the determination to restore unquestioned control. Armed groups formed, joined by local authorities and reinforced by outside forces, blurring any line between civilian action and official response. In the countryside surrounding Elaine, violence unfolded with overwhelming force, leaving black communities defenseless against a coordinated assault. The scale of what followed was staggering. Hundreds of African American men, women, and children were killed, many without any connection to the original meetings. Homes were destroyed, families fled into fields and forests, and entire communities were silenced almost overnight. News from the region was tightly controlled, shaped by official statements that framed the events as necessary suppression rather than mass tragedy. For those who survived, fear did not end when the violence stopped. It lingered through arrests, trials, and the constant threat of retaliation. What made the Elaine massacre especially significant was not only its brutality, but its clarity. Unlike the urban unrest in Chicago or Washington, where chaos and rumor fed confusion, the events in Arkansas exposed a system willing to deploy overwhelming force to preserve economic and racial hierarchy. The same anxieties present elsewhere: job insecurity, post-war instability, and shifting expectations were present here as well. But in the rural South, those pressures collided with an older structure of control, producing consequences far deadlier and far less visible to the rest of the nation. The aftermath extended beyond immediate loss of life. Survivors faced prosecution rather than protection, while those responsible for the violence largely avoided accountability. It took years of legal struggle and national attention to challenge the narrative imposed by local authorities. Even then, the full scope of what happened remained buried in silence for decades. remembered primarily through oral history and community memory rather than official record. In the broader context of the summer of 1919, Elaine stands as a grim counterpoint to the events unfolding in America's cities. It demonstrated that the crisis gripping the nation was not confined to industrial centers or contested neighborhoods. It reached into the fields and farms where economic dependence and racial control were most entrenched. The massacre revealed how quickly demands for fairness could be met with overwhelming violence when institutions were aligned against change. Together with the unrest in Chicago and other cities, Elaine exposed a nation struggling to reconcile its ideals with its realities. Victory in World War I had raised expectations of democracy and justice. But the response in Arkansas showed how fragile those promises remained for African Americans, especially in regions where power went unchallenged. The events there were not an exception to the story of Red Summer. They were its most devastating expression. A reminder that when fear and authority merged, the cost could be measured not only in broken trust, but in countless lost lives. As the unrest spread from city streets to rural communities, a deeper pattern became impossible to ignore. Again and again, the institutions entrusted with maintaining order revealed their limits, their biases, or their absence altogether. Local governments hesitated, police forces acted selectively, and federal authority arrived late or not at all. For Black communities already living with economic pressure and social exclusion, this failure carried a clear message. Protection was uncertain, and justice was conditional. In northern cities like Chicago and Washington, officials often appeared overwhelmed by the speed and scale of events. Yet their responses rarely felt neutral. Law enforcement units were deployed unevenly, intervening aggressively in some neighborhoods while remaining distant in others. For Black residents, this inconsistency reinforced long-standing distrust. Calls for help were unanswered, reports dismissed, and visible presence came only after damage had already been done. The impression left behind was not simply one of incompetence, but of indifference shaped by race. This pattern echoed what Black migrants had already learned upon arriving in these cities. Segregation was not written into every law, but it was enforced through practice, habit, and selective enforcement. When tensions erupted, those unwritten rules became decisive. Authorities prioritized restoring a version of order that preserved existing boundaries rather than addressing the grievances that had fueled the unrest. In doing, they signaled that stability mattered more than fairness, and quiet streets mattered more than equal protection. In the South, the dynamic was even more stark. In places like Elaine, Arkansas, local authorities did not merely fail to intervene. They became part of the machinery that crushed Black resistance. The same officials who controlled courts, jails, and public narratives framed violence as necessity and organization as threat. Federal involvement, when it came, often reinforced local power rather than challenging it. The line between civilian action and official authority blurred until it was almost indistinguishable, leaving Black communities with no clear avenue for safety or appeal. What united these experiences across regions was not identical behavior, but a shared outcome. Institutions that claimed neutrality operated within a social order already tilted against Black Americans. Their decisions reflected that imbalance, whether through delayed responses, selective arrests, or silence in the face of injustice. Even when officials expressed concern, their actions rarely disrupted the structures that had allowed the violence to unfold in the first place. This institutional failure deepened the psychological impact of the summer. Violence could be survived, homes rebuilt, and jobs regained, but the loss of faith in public protection lingered. Black families learned that safety depended less on law than on community, less on promises than on preparation. Churches, veterans groups, and neighborhood organizations took on roles the state had abandoned, not out of defiance, but necessity. At the same time, This reality forced a reckoning within Black political thought. The expectation that progress would naturally follow loyalty and patience had already been shaken by war and migration. Now it was further eroded by visible evidence that citizenship did not guarantee protection. This realization did not extinguish hope, but it reshaped it, shifting focus toward collective action. Legal challenges and self-advocacy. For the nation as a whole, the failure of authorities during Red Summer exposed a dangerous contradiction. America presented itself as a defender of democracy on the world stage, yet struggled to uphold its principles at home. The uneven application of law revealed how deeply racial hierarchy was woven into governance itself. Peace was restored not by resolving injustice, but by exhausting those most affected by it. In the broader narrative of 1919, institutional failure was not a background detail. It was a central force. It allowed fear to escalate, resentment to harden, and violence to spread unchecked. By revealing where power stood and whom it protected, that summer reshaped the relationship between Black communities and the American state. The lesson was painful but clear. When institutions fail to act justly, their silence speaks as loudly as any action, and its consequences can echo for generations. As the fires of that turbulent summer finally faded, something irreversible had changed within Black America. Red Summer was not only a season of loss and trauma, it was a moment of awakening. For generations, survival had often meant endurance, keeping one's head down, moving quietly, and hoping that restraint would bring safety. The events of 1919 shattered that belief. Across cities and rural towns alike, African Americans learned that silence did not guarantee protection, and patience did not prevent injustice. What emerged in its place was a new understanding of collective strength. Communities that had been forced to defend their homes, families, and neighborhoods began to rethink their relationship with power. Veterans brought discipline and strategic thinking. Migrants brought numbers, networks, and economic leverage. Churches, newspapers, and civic groups became spaces not just for comfort, but for coordination. Self-defense was no longer seen as reckless defiance. It became a measured response to a reality in which institutions had failed. This shift did not mean abandoning hope in democracy, but redefining how it would be claimed. Red Summer also transformed political consciousness. The contradiction between American ideals and American practice was no longer abstract. It had been lived, witnessed, and survived. African Americans increasingly understood their struggle as national rather than local, systemic rather than accidental. Legal challenges. Voter mobilization. Labor organizing and public advocacy gained new urgency. The demand was no longer simply for tolerance, but for rights clearly defined, publicly defended, and legally enforced. This change echoed far beyond 1919. The resolve forged during Red Summer would surface again in the decades that followed, shaping movements that challenged segregation, discrimination, and inequality at every level of society. The confidence to resist injustice openly, the willingness to organize collectively, and the refusal to accept violence as fate all became defining features of future civil rights activism. What had begun as survival evolved into strategy, and what had once been endurance became resistance. At the same time, Red Summer left a warning for the nation as a whole. It showed what happens when economic fear, racial hierarchy, and institutional failure intersect without accountability. It revealed that peace built on inequality is fragile, and that ignoring injustice only delays confrontation rather than preventing it. The events of 1919 forced America to confront itself, even if it was not yet ready to change. Today, remembering Red Summer is not about reopening old wounds, but understanding their origins. It reminds us that progress has never been inevitable, and that every expansion of freedom has been contested. The courage displayed during that summer did not erase suffering, but it reshaped the future by proving that dignity could be defended, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and reflect on a chapter of history that still echoes into the present. If you found this narrative meaningful and believe these stories deserve to be remembered and understood, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps keep important history alive and ensures that voices once pushed to the margins are never forgotten.